Good evening, everyone. It's really good to be here. Thank you. Thank you. As Richard mentioned, I am married with 6 grown children, and I wanted to start out just to tell you a story that will kind of connect to maybe our situation with especially our young people in the church today. A story about my daughter, Becca. Three of my 4 girls, I got 4 girls and 2 boys, so 3 of the girls are in education, and 2 are working in high schools now. And Becca was working in grade school. Do you call it grade school, like elementary school? So she, you teach, do we have any grade school teachers here? All right, a few of you. You know how you teach all the classes? You teach math, you teach science, you teach English. So Beck's teaching all the classes, and she comes to me one day and she says, "Dad," she was teaching on the solar system in science class, and she says, "Dad, you know that you're a failure as a science teacher when one of your students comes up to you and he's really proud, he's really excited, and he says, 'Mrs. Holland, I'm going to be the first man to walk on the sun.'" And so she says, I said, "Well, Beck," he goes, "Wait, it gets worse, Dad." And so what she did was she gave him that look, that look you'd give somebody who would say something like that, and she was like, "Oh." And another wave of confidence came over him, and he looked at her and he says, "Yeah, I know what you're thinking." And so she thought, okay, maybe he gets this. And he looks at her and he says, "Don't worry, I'm going to do it at night." Well, Beck left teaching. She truly felt like a failure, and I say that in reference to so much of our loss of young people. We've often, I think as a church, what's going on with our young people, the disaffiliation, the losses of numbers. Now, I don't know if you've noticed that anecdotally. If you haven't noticed it anecdotally, just look at research. Our young people have been moving away from the church in really record numbers. No other generation has disaffiliated in the same manner. And I think a lot of that was we were unprepared for the millennials. It kind of started with millennials. Millennials generally born from 1982 or so until probably about 2000 or 82. I'm sorry, 82 to 2002 or so, in that range there. So how many of you are millennials in the crowd? Okay, not many. That proves my point. So we're missing some millennials here. So we were unprepared, but the thing is, we weren't the only ones unprepared for them. Marketers, they couldn't figure out millennials. They confounded the marketers. They've confounded employers. How many of you are employing millennials? They're like, what do we do with these guys? And so I think as a whole society, we have been very much unprepared for them. Even I was in youth ministry for 10 years in a parish. And during that time, we grew our youth ministry from like 12 kids to 500 kids, from 2 adult leaders to 75 adult leaders. Things were going well, started cultivation ministries to really help that happen in other parishes all over. And things were going well until the millennials got into high school. And they weren't responding to the things that I had done in previous years. I was like, wow, this always works. But with the millennials, it wasn't working. And so I was really confounded, so much so that the book Engaging a New Generation was my going back and saying, what is going on? We were unprepared. When we're unprepared, things don't go well. They don't go well. When my kids were small, there's a story about being unprepared. When my kids were small, they got involved in a group that was, it was a group a friend of mine was highly involved with. And his kids would go there. It was like, I think, every Monday night. And it wasn't a Catholic group, but it was a group where I had twins that were 6 years old. They were going and they were learning scriptures. They were playing games. They were having fun. But it was really cool. They were learning the scriptures, and I really liked that. And but at the end of their involvement, my my kids come home and they have like a block of wood and 2 axles and 4 tires. So it is a pine wood derby. Have you ever been involved in a pine wood derby where you build the cars? Well, I called my friend because I didn't know, what's the protocol here? Do I help my kids build it? And so I called my friend whose kids were highly involved in it, and I asked him, what's the protocol? What should I do? And this is how he prepared me. He said, let the kids build the car. This is a kid's thing. It should, be, 6-year-old car. And I said, oh, okay. So, I took the kids and I let them draw their car, and, I didn't let them use a bandsaw at 6 or anything like that. But, they built their cars. I shaved around with a jigsaw and let them sand it and paint it, and they drilled holes to put their axles in. And, when they were all done, it looked like 2 6-year-olds made the car. So the night came where the last gathering, and so when we got there, my kids had their car. They were very excited, very proud, until we walked into the room and they had a table where they set up all the cars. And we noticed immediately that there was no car that was built by any of the kids. These cars looked like they were built by indie engineers. They were incredible. And of course, so my kids' cars are sitting out there and they look pathetic. They really stuck out. And so I remember like trying to comfort them, because their cars were, and people were kind of snickering. And I remember putting my arm around the 2 of them, 6 years old, and I said, "Don't worry, guys, it's the race that counts." And they looked at me, like, okay, Dad. But I knew it was only going to get worse. So my daughter Sarah's car was in one of the first heats, and she was going up against one of those polished beauties that Dad spent a lot of time working on. And so the gate goes down, and that polished beauty streaks down the track. My daughter Sarah's car slides to a pathetic halt in the middle of the track. And at this point, the young kid, he gets his car victoriously, and everybody in the room is waiting to see who's going to pick up that car. And it was just quiet. Maybe it was just me, but it seemed like everyone was waiting and looking who built that pathetic thing. And so across the room is my daughter, and she looks at me with big, beautiful blue eyes, and she looks at me, but she's across the room, and I can't communicate with her, but her eyes said everything, and her eyes said to me, "Dad, you get the car." And it was not one of my best fatherly moments, because I remember putting my head down and saying, like, "You're on your own, little girl." Yeah, it was terrible. It was terrible. But my son's car did worse. I mean, it was a terrible, terrible night. But I was prepared. My friend prepared me for something that really wasn't the case. I mean, I was not prepared well in this situation. And we never went back. We never went back. And in the same way, our lack of preparation for when the millennials arrived. Now we got Gen Z right in the ranks here. But our lack of preparation, because we didn't know what they were going to be like, has very much resulted in a loss of membership. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that today. What has happened? What are some of the changes that have occurred that we were not prepared for? Now we're not working. Oh, here we go. Let's try that. All right. We're unprepared for the Millennial Generation. One of the ways we're unprepared, I'm going to go through just a few of these things, then we're going to kind of hit our topic on the caller ID. Previous generations, some of you in this room, you kind of inherited your faith. It was never really a question. Mom and Dad were Catholic. We went to church on Sundays. That's just what you do. You go to church on Sundays. Well, when millennials came around, and maybe even a little earlier, it was different. Millennials chose church. Now, those of you who are older, I know you had a choice. You did. But your choice was limited. Your choice was you can go to church or you could go to hell. And many of you, you decided that church was probably the better option. But here's the deal. Our young people today are Catholic guilt resistant. They're Catholic guilt resistant, which is a very different thing than many of us who are sitting in this room. And we haven't done well to motivate young people in a want-to environment. A lot of what we do is still on kind of the have-to basis. And want-to is a whole different thing. And we have to make church so essential to their life that they'll actually want to go. Older generations, you found meaning in your commitments. Younger generations, they don't commit unless they find meaning. And so there's a whole reversal on that. Secondly, there we go. This is a generation that has, I think I went a little too far, didn't I? Let's go back one. Yeah, they learn by inquiry rather than by lecture. Many of us in this room, we responded to authority in our lives. We were respectful of positions and titles, and we were satisfied with God said it, I believe it, that settles it. Or Father said it. There was the whole, we trust in the authority of our leaders, the authority of the written word. We learned by reading, and we learned often by lecture from experts. So millennials, on the other hand, and this is something that Marshall McLuhan made real clear. He said, the medium is the message. And when mediums change, they change us. We grew up, many in the room here, we grew up maybe on television, but often print as the dominant medium and lecture as the dominant way of learning. Young people today have grown up on the internet, and that changes everything. They are growing up in the internet age where when you want to know something, you type in an inquiry. You go on Google and you basically type in what you want to know. You ask questions, in other words. So questioning is the new mode of learning with many people. And it's so it's all about questions. And with that, we also have seen a shift where young people, they want their truth to be practical. In other words, they want it to work in real life. That's a kind of an expression of postmodern truth. And so many of us who kind of grew up in a place where, well, Father said it, the church teaches it, we didn't question. We didn't learn by questioning. We learned by reading. We learned by lecture. And now we have a generation that is learning by questioning. They're asking us questions that we're not equipped to answer because we've never really asked them. But it isn't, sometimes people think, well, young people, they don't believe anything. They're just skeptical. That really isn't the case. They learn by asking. They want to know, in that asking, does this stuff work in real life? So there's this practical truth that's kind of an expression of more of a postmodern way of thinking. And so what we have to do is we have to open up the hood to God's teaching. We have to open up the hood and kind of expose the engine. How is this teaching powered by God's love and God's protection and God's provision for us? And that's something that many of us who are older, we have not been used to doing, and we've lost some young people because they have felt like their answers haven't been answered. And they have, or we've said things like, well, you just got to believe, which isn't enough for this generation to hold them. Now, they have little tolerance for passive learning. Back in probably the late 90s, well, prior to this, youth rallies, I don't know if maybe the Diocese of London had youth rallies, but all over the U.S. we had youth rallies and youth conferences. And in the 80s and the 90s, our numbers kept growing. And there were some places that were having over 1,000 young people coming to these events. And then when the millennials started getting to high school, we started to see kind of things kind of holding steady. And then as the late 90s into the 2000s, we watched these numbers decline. And we were always doing the same thing that we had been doing in the past. And we really, what is going on with this generation? Because young people like Gen X teens who were, when our numbers were growing, Gen X teens grew up on television. And they were used to sitting and taking in what was going on the screen. So there was this, they were comfortable with kind of a passive type of message where you had kind of experts, just like television, you got expert producers and actors, and they were comfortable with the experts on the stage, and they responded well to what we might call evangelitainment. Evangelitainment was, where you're evangelizing, but there's kind of an entertaining approach from the stage, kind of stage-centric. Now millennials, again, they grew up in more of an internet style of learning, and so it's very different. They needed they needed options, because what do you do on the internet? You hyperlink. You have options. So they needed options. They needed some variety. They needed things that were interactive that they could participate in, because they're used to posting, they're used to commenting, so there's a whole interactive type of environment that is very different. And so many of them might be bored at Mass because they didn't feel like I'm not participating enough. I'm not in a meaningful way. And so many people will say, like, yeah, young people, they want to be entertained. But this is a generation that it doesn't want to be entertained. They want to be engaged. Engagement for them involves connection to the people around them. So when they go to Mass on Sunday, they want to feel a relational connection to the person next to them. And when they don't feel that there's this lack of connection that often causes them eventually to not come back. So not only do they want to feel relationally connected, but they want to be emotionally engaged. And many of us who are older is like, well, you go to Mass on Sunday, there's, we find meaning in that commitment. But they're looking for, to have an emotional reaction to the homily, like this really connects to my life. Emotional reaction to the worship, that in a sense I could feel God in the room. Because authenticity is the currency in which they exchange life. Authenticity is emotional honesty. And saying, well, I'm not feeling anything here, so could it really be real? And that puts a lot of burden on us, I think, for liturgy and events. It's a tough sell. But that is, with their emotions being engaged, their relational connection and having good participation are all elements that have to do with the engagement that they're looking for. That has a lot to do with they've been raised on a whole different platform with the internet. Here's another change that has occurred, is that, and this is, I think many generations have been all about relationships, but this is a generation that, well, let's talk about some of us who are a little older. When we talked about youth ministry, and we talked about relational youth ministry, we always use this phrase called "earn the right to be heard." Has anyone ever heard that? Earn the right to be heard. It was coined by Jim Rayburn, the founder of Young Life. And we were, when I was young, we were okay with people earning the right to be heard in relationships. We were okay with people entering into a relationship with us with an agenda, because in a modern world, life was objectified, and mission and agendas were often more important, or considered more important, than the people they served. And so we were not put off by people who were initiating a relationship with an agenda of greater value. And so as long as people accepted you for who you were okay with a relationship that was governed by their desire to influence you. That all changed with millennials and post-millennials. Today, young people don't respond to relationships with agendas. If they feel that the relationship, you're initiating a relationship as a strategy of influence in their life, then they see that as an insult. They see that as, well, we're people, we're not projects. We want to be loved for who we are, and not for a larger purpose that you have maybe for our life. And so we have to move, and with this nuance, we have to move from how can I influence you to who are you in your joy and in your sorrows. From influence to accompaniment, a word that we're hearing quite a bit in these days. So the relationships with agendas don't work anymore. It doesn't mean that we don't walk in with attention to want to share our faith, but we do it with simply loving that person, listening to that person, being with that person. And that is a strong distinction that has occurred with this generation. So here's, we're going to move into the caller ID piece here. Gen X teens, like if you built it, they came. It was a wonderful time in youth ministry. You know, we would put on events and we'd do a whole promotional plan. For the first time ever, have a youth ministry in a parish, and we'd get 50, 75, 100 kids during those Gen X teen years that would come. Now, Gen X, you send them a flyer, or you'd make an announcement at Mass. They were at Mass, so they heard it. And so they weren't nearly as busy as some of our younger kids today. And they were, I don't know if you remember the nickname for Gen X when they were kids. They were called the latchkey kids. That's because the highest spike of divorce occurred during their childhood, and many of them came home to empty houses. So they were really looking for things to do. We would say things in youth ministry, if only kids had more things to do, they'd be better off. Well, it's very different today. If you build it, they won't necessarily come. Instead, it's this. Oops. Let's go back. If I know you, and you personally invite me, and remind me the day before, and text me the day of, I might come. I might come. So millennials, they're growing up in the information age. They're busier than any other generation. And this is also true of the Gen Z that's following them. They're technologically sophisticated, but they are untrusting and unswayed by impersonal means of invitation. So they have so many things coming at them by so many suitors. And they were raised by uber protective parents. Gen X parents who are very protective. In many ways, they look at their own childhood as the blueprint of what not to do. I want to make sure that my kids' life, they're highly protected so that they don't have time unorganized, where maybe they could get in trouble like I did when I was their age. And so there's this uber protectiveness of parents. There's also a political climate. I don't know if it's as much here as it is in the U.S., but we have new terms like post-truth, fake news, alternative facts. These are things that are not only our young people feel like that they grew up protected, but in addition to that, they're wondering, who could I trust? What is even real anymore? And they've circled their wagons. They've circled the wagons. Like if you ask them who their heroes are their parents, because they know their parents. They could trust their parents or their grandparents. It's the people close to them that they could trust, because I don't know any one layer out. And also, especially with Gen Z, that their kid or their parents are highly protective about who's involved in their kids' lives. So there's this sense of distrust that they have that brings us to having having these two generations, especially a caller ID generation. And if you saw the little, the promo of this presentation here, Marshall McLuhan, it's kind of based on what he said. He said, "We shape our tools, and thereafter our tools shape us." Caller ID was developed in '68, but by 2010, everybody had it. And I'd have to ask you, I mean, how many of you answer 800 numbers? Or maybe you don't have 800. It might be a U.S. Oh, you do? Sometimes, yeah. So how many of you answer them when you see them? How many of you answer numbers that you don't recognize? There's a few of you in here that do. Okay. But the vast majority of you have become a caller ID generation. We have kind of insulated ourselves from others. And if we don't know you, you're simply an 800 number to us. So it has that technology has impacted how we see life. And technology in many ways has closed our world up. In many ways, it's closed us up to other relationships. And when you also consider the smartphones, smartphones are often great ways to kind of keep people away. Like when you're in an awkward situation, maybe you're waiting at a bus stop and there's another person there that you don't know. What do? You take your phone out and you start to get busy. It happens if you're at a party and you don't know anybody, take your phone out. So it really alleviates awkward moments when maybe in the past we might have initiated a conversation with someone instead. So we have all, in many ways, become a caller ID generation. And with furthermore, with especially with millennials, they don't trust people. They're the least trusting generation. Now, these are U.S. statistics, but I would venture to say they're pretty close to statistics here in Canada. So generally speaking, would you say that most people can be trusted? Boomers, pretty trusting. Those older than boomers, a little less trusting. Gen X, even less. And millennials, way down. Only 19% of them say, generally speaking, they could trust most people. So it's a hard sell to necessarily get them to come to church unless you know them. And we're going to talk about that. So just some quick stats here. This is marketers are always interested in how do you reach this generation. 70% of millennials, said that everything feels so chaotic in this world that it's hard to know who or what to follow. You're going to circle your wagons in a situation like that. 6% consider online advertising to be credible. 95% say that friends are the most credible source of information for products. So these are again our marketers, like how do we reach this group? And so it's through people they know. 91% of millennials would consider purchasing a product if a friend recommended it. Again, it's someone I could trust and know. 98% millennials are more likely to engage with a friend's post over a brand's post. 92% reported that trust plays a factor in who influences them online. Okay, so the question, and this is not just them. I think for many of you are probably listening to a number of things that I've said about our younger generations, and you may be thinking, wait a second, I'm older and I feel that way too. So many of us could be, certainly have that caller ID mentality. And so the question is, how do we do ministry? How do we reach out and evangelize in a world that's more of a caller ID mentality? And the answer is we become known numbers. We become known numbers. We move out of the 800 number and into known numbers. So let's talk about, well, how does that happen? And I'm not saying this is easy. This is going to be very challenging because people's worlds has gotten closer or has kind of closed up. And many people will, just to kind of deal with the situation, they seek people that think just like them, even insulated them even further. So how do we do this? So first thing I want to suggest is that we begin at the parish level. We begin by integrating young people into the larger parish community. Because you can be an 800 number in your parish. A lot of young people feel that way. That's one of the things that I noticed immediately is that in the past when we'd make an announcement at Mass, kids would come. But now, if you made the announcement and they didn't feel connected to the person who made the announcement or knew people who were intimately involved, they would dismiss it like they'd never heard it. And often even say, well, I didn't hear that. So it has to come from a trusted source. And so beginning by integrating young people into the larger life of the community instead of treating them as future church, but treating them in a way that they're the present church, they're warmly welcomed into every aspect of church life, is critical. Because then they start to develop relationships. Now, I'm not saying you let children be in the marriage ministry or anything like that. I mean, there are certainly places where they wouldn't be appropriate. But I think overall, we want to move where young people are expected to participate, discover their gifts, use their gifts, make decisions, and lead large church activities. Now, what happens when we do that? When we integrate and we ask the question, how old do you have to be involved in this ministry? If we ask that question with every ministry, like for ushers, for instance, I mean, how old do you really have to be? Could you be 6 years old and kind of be mentored by some of the other ushers? Yeah, I think you probably could. Now, if we ask this question with all the ministries, and we also had kind of an intergenerational attitude that we would say, you know what, we're going to invite you in. We're not just going to say on paper, yeah, you could come, but we were actually going to want you to be a part of this and integrate you into our usher community. And so what happens is that young person develops a relationship with these ushers. They know that person by name. They've prayed maybe with those ushers. Maybe they were in a small group where they listened to those ushers share about why they are committed to Jesus. And so they're developing these faith mentors in their lives. But in addition to that, when they get there on Sunday, what happens is they're being greeted by 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 ushers calling that young person by name. And now all of a sudden, they don't feel like an 800 number in their own communities. Because as Catholics, let's face it, and especially in larger parishes, you can be an 800 number. We could all be 800 numbers to one another. We could sit next to the same family at Mass and really for years and not even really know their name. Well, most we might have done is smiled at them. We are 800 numbers to one another. Well, beginning by integrating young people into the church in an intergenerational way will help stop that with some of the kids that we presently have. That they find the church a safe, hospitable place. A place where they have lots of relationships with lots of adults. As a matter of fact, some of the best research on what is really working with teenagers states that for every young person, every teenager, for example, if they could have 5 adults that they could go to in the parish, that will make a huge difference in terms of their faith being strong as young adults. Oftentimes, we have none, let alone 5. But it's a different way to think. This is all about relationships. So this is what happens. That young person, over the course of time, by being integrated into the parish, they have all of these relationships. No longer are they an 800 number in their own faith community. So that's one of the first ways, and I think what that will do is help us address what is going on in the parish, not necessarily outside. So we're just trying to make sure that people in the parish don't feel like 800 numbers. Next, I think we have to begin to move more from programs to community. And again, this isn't rocket science. But the early church was really, they were organized as communities, people who loved one another. Here are some of the things that you'll find in the scriptures when they're talking about the churches. The parishes, if you will, that they're called to love one another. Have a fervent love for one another, Romans states. They pray for one another, care for one another. They bear one another's burdens. They encourage one another. They spur one another on to good deeds. They admonish one another, and they speak the truth in love. I believe that conversion really follows the arc of attachments. Well, you don't convert in situations where you have not developed relationships with people. And so building these relationships in our community is absolutely critical. They make people feel wanted, cared for. They will also, just an example, bear one another burden. We have, when our twins were born, they were premature. They were 8 weeks premature. So they spent 5.5 weeks in the hospital. We had a community around us, and we were new to the community. I just really was hired there within a year, so we didn't know a lot of people. And so we ended up having to do a 110-mile round trip every day to visit those kids. So, which meant we didn't have a lot of time to eat. And it was a very crazy time. They were, very, very sick on ventilators, and it was very difficult. And our parish, not only did they created a baby fund because of the cost of that care, but in addition to that, they gave my wife a baby shower, and then they organized meals for us to be delivered by people in the parish. And so as new people in the parish, we couldn't have felt more loved as they helped really bear this burden in our life. But in addition to that, there was one evening where my in-laws came. They lived from out of town and they hadn't yet met the twins. So they came over and we were taking them to the hospital, but one of the families brought a dinner for all of us. And my father-in-law was a kind of a tough, salty guy. He fought, in World War II. He came in like 7 days after D-Day, crawled over bodies. He was a tough guy. And he had stopped going to church years ago because of all the hypocrites. I don't want nothing to do with church. It's just a bunch of hypocrites. So as he sat in that chair, and this couple brought over an incredible meal, like 5-course wine. I mean, just really incredible act of love. They start taking this stuff out and putting it on the table. My father-in-law, this tough guy, just welled up with tears. He just cried. And that day, he started to pray again. He started to say grace at the table. And there was a movement because of the wonderful love that was experienced here. And also bear one another's burdens. I've seen groups. I was in a group, and this is all stuff. Like, when this stuff happens, you don't want to leave. When I build youth ministries, this is what I use. I say, this is what we got to be as a team. As a ministerial team, we got to love one another. We got to bear one another's burdens. I watched one of the groups, a woman come in with her back almost hunched over, and that wasn't her normal posture. She came in, you could see very visibly, very palpably, that she was struggling and hurting. And what's wrong, Mary? It was immediate. And then she started to talk about all these things that she had to do, and she was completely overwhelmed. And as she mentioned each thing, I watched a person in that group say, I will do that for you. I will take that. Just give me just after the meal, after our meeting, tell me what you need in terms done, and just give it to me. It's done. It's over. And I watched her walk out straight, with a straight posture again. But this is the kind of stuff that makes things real, where we're not 800 numbers to one another. This is the thing that we could invite others to. Who wouldn't want to be loved like that? And so I think we have to transition away from simply putting on programs to really building communities. Every time we do gather, do we have an opportunity to get to know the people around us and find out what's going on in their lives? One of the things that we would do with each group is that when we take some time to share life, and if somebody talked about something going on that needed prayer, we stop the meeting, we pray for them. Is our communities places where people actually know what's going on in your life and will pray for you? Or will that happen? Will you do that for others? But these are the kind of things that evangelize within. We become this evangelizing community, so those who are within it are evangelized. Why? Because they are encountering the body of Christ. The body of Christ wasn't meant to simply be a theological term. The body of Christ is being the presence of Jesus. And we're meant to be the presence of Jesus to one another. And that's an evangelizing experience. But on top of that, not only do people that are involved get evangelized through community, but we also build the kind of place that we could invite others to be a part of in a way that they themselves will be evangelized if they walk into that environment. Jesus said in John 13:35, "You'll know my disciples by their love for one another." And that should really be our legacy. That should be our identity in the world around us. That should actually be our apologetic. That is our defense of the gospel and how we love. And these are the kind of things like we've kind of gravitated towards programs and events. But being a community that really not only gives from within, but is giving from without, is going to be something that people are going to want to be a part of. they will not be 800 numbers from within. But more like, in addition to like the stuff from the inside, keeping who we have, another thing we really got to really focus on is developing an evangelizing spirituality. Now, a number of years ago, I started watching The Sopranos. You know, I was like 10 years late on it, but I started to watch The Sopranos. And the reason why I liked it, because I'm 100% Italian. So I could relate. I could relate to like the gabagol and the agita and the just the whole like the food and the mob hits. Well, maybe not the mob hits. That was not part of my experience, but I could relate to all of this stuff. And I saw like so often like there was food and like they always were gathering at restaurants and eating. It was like, and that's how I grew up. It was in the blood of us as Italians. That's how you love. You feed people. And so we have, we have these things as a part of us as a people. As Catholics, we do. In our blood, we know that Eucharist is central. We're a sacramental people. We have a love for Mary. This is a part of what it means to be Catholic. But evangelization is as Catholic as Eucharist. Every one of us, by virtue of our baptism, we are called to share our faith, but it has never really integrated into our everyday spirituality as Eucharist, for instance, and Mary, and so forth. So this is a thing that we need to focus on. We have to be out in the world and being known numbers in the world. And so how do we do that? How do you develop an evangelizing spirituality? First, model it. We as leaders, we've got to model it. One day, I had some kids come over, and they were kids from my youth group. And they went downstairs. I told them, well, go downstairs, and I was going to bring down some refreshments for them. And as I'm getting things ready, I could hear this laughter downstairs, kind of hysterical laughter from the guys. There were 3 guys, and I was like, "Wow, what's going on?" So I start to make my way down there, and I see them. They are laughing, but they're pointing at my 6-year-old son Michael, and they're like bent over laughing. And there's a dad walking in, like, what are you doing, laughing at my son like that? And they see me, and my face is like, "What are you doing?" And they looked. No, it's not what you think. It's just that he looks and he acts and he has all the same mannerisms that you have. And then I realized they were laughing at me. That was what was going on. But here's my son, and he had my posture, he had everything. And so you become what you're around. And it's so critical for us as leaders, as catechetical leaders, as pastoral leaders, whatever ministry we're in. It's critical that we model evangelization, that it is a language that we speak, because you cannot learn Spanish in an English-speaking household. And so if we're not an evangelizing household of faith, people will not learn that language. So as leaders, we really have to become evangelizers. And I'm amazed, because I do a lot of work with people who work professionally in the church, but I'm amazed at how few of us actually share our faith outside of the church. And that's exactly what we'd be asking our parishioners to do. So we have to be able to be in environments outside church and be comfortable sharing the good news with others. So modeling is really one of the first steps for people to get a language of evangelization. I think secondly, we have to bring a meaningful relationship with God to people so that you want to share it, Why did the Word become flesh? Because words really can't get you there. Words are theory. They're secondhand descriptions. We need experiences. We need encounters. And so young people and all people really need to be encountering God in a way that relationship is rich and meaningful. In other words, we need to practice experiential Christianity, and that's basically being a mystic. It's as simple as it is. It's experiential Christianity. And so we could, as people develop their relationship with God, it becomes so meaningful and so rich that we would say along with Paul, the love of Christ compels me to share the gospel. And I'm here today. I'm here because I had that encounter, 17 years old, changed my life, absolutely revolutionized my life. And I couldn't think of anything more that I wanted to invest my life in than sharing that same good news with young people who were at the same age I was when I received it, and it so transformed my life and impacting every decision I made. And so developing that evangelistic spirituality involves helping us develop that kind of relationship with God, the practices that bring us into an encounter with God, so that it's so real to us that we're compelled by Christ's love to share it with others. The next element, I think I went too far. We need one, go back one. All right. Well, two. Let's go back here. People. We really want to help people understand that people matter to God. We can't really just, I got my salvation. I got my relationship with God. Jesus was always about the lost coin. He was about the lost sheep, the lost son. We know the father was looking out in the horizon, waiting for the son to come home. And so we too have to cultivate a love for others, a care for others. I showed a video today to youth ministers, and it was from Penn Jillette. Familiar with Penn Jillette from Penn and Teller? He's an avowed atheist, but he has a little video blog where he talks about meeting a guy after his show. And this guy is a Christian. And he said, I believe this guy knew I'm an atheist, but this guy gave him a Bible, and he gave him a phone number, was very complimentary to him, his use of language, and Penn Jillette was really touched by this guy in the sense that he was saying this guy was a really, really good guy. He kept calling him sane. I think he must have met some crazy Christians down the road, but he was sane, he was honest, he was a good man. And he cared enough. He said, he cared enough about me to want to, he used the term, proselytize me. And then he said something that I think is just an amazing thing to hear from an atheist. He said that, I don't respect Christians who don't share their faith with others. He said, if you believe in eternal life and you believe there are some people that may not receive eternal life and you don't share it with them because it's socially awkward. And then he says this, he says, how much do you have to hate someone not to tell them about eternal life? That's from an atheist. And so I think it's a great challenge to us about really loving people enough. I mean, we don't have to walk in, presuming they're going to hell. I mean, our relationship with God should be a motivator. I want you to have what I have. So people do matter. We have to, I think, design intentional evangelistic gatherings, critical stuff, that we have places where we could bring people that we have been sharing with. And often I'll ask people, how many of you could think of a regular gathering that's going on that you could bring your neighbors, your co-workers, your friends to, that where they might walk in and experience state-of-the-art hospitality, that they might hear the good news in a way that might connect with their lives. In other words, that we have an evangelistic gathering that outsiders could come to. So if we talk about evangelization and we don't develop those kind of things, then we're really not supporting the people we're asking to evangelize. So we have to examine that. And I would say that Mass is probably not the place for most of them. Maybe a returning Catholic, but maybe someone who has no faith at all, they're not going to know what to do and how to act, or it'll be probably more difficult for them than if they didn't go. So do we have venues? Do we have gatherings? Do we have events or opportunities that we all know we can bring people to? And that's an important support to developing and evangelistic spirituality. And then we have to train. To do that, I think we have to learn how do you share your faith with others. So we need to give the tools and the skills to people and the accountability to go out and do that. Critical that we have those kind of things going on. So that will take us outside in reaching people that are not involved in the community. And finally, we have to go. We have to get out of the church, and we have to. These are the places where young people are going. They're going to the CrossFit gyms. That's their new communities. That's where they're finding connection. They're going to the local breweries. That's where they're finding connection. So these are called places that maybe we need to be hanging out at. Maybe we need to get in shape. Go get in shape. But also on top of that, how about developing relationships with people outside of your normal church sphere? My wife and I will always sit at a bar and at a restaurant, and it's always to invite the possibility of having conversation with people around us. And I'll tell you, we've had many divine appointments, people who sit next to us, who we strike up conversations with and have an opportunity to share faith with. And some are ongoing. We go to the same restaurant for the most part and have developed a relationship with all of the staff who are all unchurched and developing just those relationships, finding their spiritual hungers. There's a young man named Charlie who, I'm a home brewer, so Charlie was interested in brewing, so I brought him over and we brewed together. He started brewing, so we have that to talk about. But on top of that, in one of those conversations, Charlie, he said, I feel like an utter failure. I'm 28 years old. I work in a kitchen. And so we just had a wonderful time to talk about how we felt. And it really gave me a sense of, well, what do I need to be doing for Charlie? And so I've bought him books on cooking because he loves to cook and he's a good cook. I bought him books on brewing to help him develop that. So, Charlie, you're really gifted and you're really good in these areas. And then he's starting now to ask me to pray for, not necessarily for him, but for other people. So these are places that we as Catholics, we have to learn, or we have to start to step out and go. Thresholds are, what we mean by that is that there are a lot of people that won't step into a church. So we get on another threshold that may move them to the church. It may scaffold them in over time. So maybe as a church we start developing things like that, like community centers. When I was in youth ministry, I did a weight room and youth center in the middle of our city that drew a lot of young people who were unchurched. That worked in our situation. But a lot of young people, even if you invite them, they may not come to church. So we may have to meet them on another ground and really develop that relationship and eventually scaffold them in and accompany them in. But this is for all of us. This is for the baptized. We've got to go. We got to go out there. And so there we go. And there is our go. And finally, that was my wife. What's she doing here? Finally, we want to ask the question so how do we reach a caller ID society? And I think it's simple. Well, it's not simple. It's very hard, but I think the answer is simple, and that is we become known numbers. We become known numbers. Okay. So, thank you.